I was always a man of routine, predictable yet dependable, or so I thought. Elena, my wife of 5 years, had a spirit that craved spontaneity. She was the kind of woman who danced barefoot in the rain while I stood under the porch, umbrella in hand. It was that untamed spark that drew me to her in the first place, but lately something about her seemed different, distant even. It started with small changes. She began spending more time on her phone, her laughter softer and reserved for moments when I wasn't in the room. She started coming home later from work, blaming meetings or errands that couldn't wait. I wanted to trust her, to believe in the woman I fell in love with, but the gnawing unease in my gut grew stronger every day. One evening, as I sat in our dimly lit living room with a glass of scotch, Elena walked in with a suitcase. Her smile was bright, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm heading out for the weekend," she said, her tone light, almost too casual. "A weekend?" I repeated, setting my glass down. "What for?" "Girls' trip," she replied. "Karen and Julie have been dying to get out of the city, and we finally found a weekend that works for all of us." Her words sounded innocent enough, but something about the way she avoided my gaze made my chest tighten. I forced a smile and nodded. "Where are you headed?" "Just up to the lake. Nothing fancy," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. As she turned to leave the room, her phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, a reflex more than anything, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. Jason. I knew that name. Jason was the ex-boyfriend she rarely mentioned, the one she dated before we met. They had a history, one she assured me was firmly in the past. My pulse quickened as I stared at the notification, a message preview I couldn't help but read. "Can't wait to see you. It's been too long." Elena returned, grabbing her phone and tucking it into her pocket without a second thought. "I'll be back Sunday night," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. The gesture felt hollow, like a formality rather than affection. "Have fun," I murmured, my voice betraying none of the turmoil bubbling inside me. When she left, the silence in the house was deafening. My mind raced, replaying every conversation, every detail that didn't add up. I tried to push the doubts aside, to convince myself that I was overthinking, but the seed of suspicion had already taken root. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. Was I paranoid, jealous, or was there something real beneath my unease? By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed answers. Elena's itinerary was vague, but her careless mention of the lake gave me a starting point. I combed through her social media and found a post from Karen, a generic photo of coffee and a packed bag with the caption, "Girls Weekend Bound." It wasn't much, but it confirmed Elena's story, at least on the surface. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Later that day, I drove to the lake. The 2-hour journey felt longer with every mile. My mind conjured images of Elena and Jason together, laughing, touching, betraying everything we'd built. I tried to dismiss them, but they clung to me like shadows. When I arrived, I parked near a popular lodge and waited, my heart pounding. Hours passed before I saw her. Elena was walking along the pier, her hand entwined with his. "Jason." My stomach churned as I watched them, their body language unmistakable. She looked at him in a way she hadn't looked at me in years, her face alight with a joy I no longer seemed to bring her. I stayed hidden, unable to confront her, unable to turn away. The pain was a physical weight pressing on my chest, but beneath it burned a flicker of anger. She was my wife. This was our life. How could she? As they disappeared into the lodge, I sat frozen, torn between heartbreak and fury. I had my answer now, but it wasn't one I was ready to face. I followed them from a distance, careful to keep out of sight. The lodge was small, nestled among towering pines, its rustic charm masking the storm brewing inside me. I parked far enough away to avoid being noticed and stepped out of the car, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire raging in my chest. Through the lodge's wide windows, I saw them check in together. Jason carried Elena's bag while she laughed at something he whispered in her ear. My fists clenched involuntarily as I watched the easy intimacy between them. They looked like a couple, like a pair that belonged together. They disappeared down a hallway, and I felt a surge of panic. If I lost sight of them, I might lose my nerve altogether. Gathering what little courage I had, I slipped inside the lodge and approached the desk, under the pretense of being a guest. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "I believe my reservation got mixed up. Can you remind me which room I'm in?" The young woman behind the counter smiled politely. "Of course. Name, please." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before giving a fake name. It was a gamble, but she didn't question it. "Looks like you're in room 12, she said, handing me a key. Room 12 was on the far end of the building, but that wasn't where I was headed. Instead, I lingered in the lobby, pretending to check my phone while keeping an eye on the hallway. I didn't have to wait long. Jason and Elena reappeared, hand in hand, and made their way toward the dining area. I followed discreetly, keeping enough distance to avoid detection. The lodge's restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place designed for stolen moments and whispered confessions. They sat at a corner table, their heads close together. Jason reached across the table, taking Elena's hand in his, and she let him. My heart pounded as I edged closer, ducking behind a pillar to stay out of sight. Their voices were low, but I caught snippets of their conversation. "I missed this," Jason said, his tone soft but filled with meaning. "So did I," Elena replied, her voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just here for a fling. This was more. I couldn't listen anymore. My breathing grew uneven as I retreated to a quiet corner of the lodge. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them, to demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Fear of hearing her confirm what I already knew. Fear of losing her completely. As the night stretched on, I struggled with what to do next. Sitting in the shadows, I watched them leave the restaurant, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the lodge's lights. They walked toward their room, Jason's arm draped casually over her shoulder. Once they disappeared inside, I forced myself to move. The lodge was quiet now, most of the guests having retired to their rooms. I wandered aimlessly, my mind replaying every moment of the day. Eventually, I found myself outside their door. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, the weight of my emotions threatening to crush me. Should I knock? Burst in? Walk away? The sound of their laughter seeped through the door, muffled but unmistakable. It was the final straw. I turned and walked away, my feet carrying me back to my car as my mind raced. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to see more, to understand why she had done this. Was it something I had done? Or was this just who she was? As I sat in my car, the cold seeping into my bones, I resolved to stay. I would watch, wait, and gather every piece of the puzzle before making my move. The next day I rose early, the restless hours of the previous night leaving me drained yet determined. I parked near the lodge, far enough to avoid suspicion, and waited. It wasn't long before I saw them. Elena and Jason emerged hand in hand, their faces bright with the carefree joy of stolen moments. They strolled toward the shoreline, their laughter carried on the crisp morning breeze. Jason stopped to pick up a smooth pebble, skipping it across the surface of the water. Elena clapped her hands in delight, leaning into him as if the world outside their bubble didn't exist. I trailed behind them, careful to keep my distance. They walked along the beach, stopping occasionally to take pictures or share private jokes. Every gesture, every look they exchanged twisted the knife deeper. By midday, they settled at a quaint outdoor cafe overlooking the bay. I chose a table far enough away to remain inconspicuous, but close enough to hear snippets of their conversation. "I never thought we'd have this again," Jason said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. Elena smiled, her gaze lingering on his face. "Neither did I. It feels right, doesn't it?" His hand covered hers on the table. "More than right. Perfect." I clenched my jaw, my nails digging into my palms under the table. The words stung, their intimacy a painful reminder of how far she'd drifted from me. They spent the afternoon exploring the town, browsing small shops, and sharing ice cream like a pair of teenagers in love. Every laugh, every touch between them felt like a betrayal, a wound that refused to stop bleeding. As evening approached, I knew I couldn't hold back any longer. I followed them to a cozy seaside restaurant, its candlelit tables offering a romantic ambiance. They sat by the window, the warm light casting a soft glow over their faces. My heart pounded as I stood outside, staring at the two of them. Part of me wanted to walk away, to preserve the illusion of ignorance for just a little longer. But the other part, the one consumed by anger and hurt, refused to let them go unchallenged. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped inside. The maitre d' greeted me with a polite smile, but I barely heard his words. My focus was solely on Elena and Jason, their heads close together as they whispered. When I reached their table, Elena looked up, her smile freezing as her eyes met mine. Her expression shifted from surprise to panic, her face draining of color. "Hello, Elena," I said, my voice low but steady. Jason straightened in his seat, his expression wary. "Who's this?" he asked, looking between us. Elena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I'm her husband," I said, the words sharp enough to cut through the tension. Jason's eyes widened as he leaned back, his demeanor shifting from confident to defensive. "Wait," he began, but I cut him off. "Elena," I said, my gaze never leaving her. "Care to explain?" She looked at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't mean for this to happen," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't mean for what?" I asked, my tone cold. "To lie to me? To cheat on me? Or to run off with him?" Her face crumpled as the weight of her actions bore down on her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to tell you. I felt so lost." "Lost?" I repeated, my voice rising despite myself. "You didn't seem lost when you planned this trip, or when you held his hand, or when you laughed like I was some forgotten memory." Jason shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Elena. "Maybe we should step outside," he suggested, his voice cautious. I turned to him, my glare silencing whatever else he had to say. "Stay out of this," I snapped. "You've done enough." The restaurant had grown quiet, the other diners casting curious glances our way. I didn't care. All I could see was the woman I thought I knew, the woman who had shattered the life we'd built together. Elena reached for my hand, her touch hesitant. "Please," she whispered, "let's talk about this. Alone." I pulled my hand away, the gesture as cold as the fury burning inside me. "You've said enough," I said, turning on my heel and walking out of the restaurant. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a wave, but it did little to quell the storm inside me. I stood there, breathing heavily, as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. A few moments later, Elena emerged, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against the chill. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice hollow. "You didn't just hurt me, Elena. You broke us." She wiped at her tears, her expression filled with regret. "I didn't know how to tell you how unhappy I've been. I didn't know how to fix it." "So you ran to him?" I asked, the bitterness in my voice undeniable. She nodded, unable to meet my gaze. He made me feel something I thought. She nodded, unable to meet my gaze. He made me feel something I thought I'd lost. I'm not saying it was right, but it's the truth. The truth. The word felt like poison on my tongue. I wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. I need time, I said finally, my voice quieter now. Time to figure out if I can forgive this, if I can forgive you. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. Without another word, I walked away, leaving her standing there in the glow of the restaurant's lights. The drive back to the city was long, the silence in my car filled with the echoes of everything that had been said. I replayed her words, her tears, and the way she had looked at me in those final moments. Despite the pain, a part of me clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, something could still be salvaged. When I arrived home, the emptiness of our house felt heavier than ever. The photographs on the walls seemed to mock me, each smiling moment a reminder of what we'd built together. I sat on the couch, staring into the void, wondering if love could survive something as shattering as betrayal. Days turned into weeks. Elena texted me occasionally, her messages apologetic and filled with pleas to talk. I didn't respond at first. I wasn't ready. I needed space to think, to feel, and to figure out if I could ever trust her again. Eventually, I agreed to meet her. We chose a neutral place, a small cafe we used to frequent when we were dating. The familiarity of it was both comforting and bittersweet. She arrived before I did, her nervous energy evident in the way she fidgeted with her cup. When she saw me, she stood, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hope. "Thank you for coming," she said softly as I sat down. I nodded, unsure of how to start. The silence between us was thick, but she was the first to break it. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "I needed to understand why I did what I did, and I needed to take responsibility for it." I raised an eyebrow, surprised but cautiously intrigued. "And what have you learned?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I let myself believe that our problems couldn't be fixed. I stopped talking to you because I thought you wouldn't listen. But that was unfair to you and to us. I was wrong to seek solace somewhere else instead of facing the truth with you." Her honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had hurt me, but as someone who was genuinely trying to make amends. "I've been thinking too," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "About us. About how things got so distant. I know I'm not blameless. I got too comfortable, too focused on work, and I stopped noticing when you needed me. But that doesn't excuse what you did." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I want to try, if you're willing." I looked at her, the woman I had loved for so long, the woman who had hurt me in ways I never thought possible. Yet, beneath the pain, I saw the same spark that had drawn me to her all those years ago. "I don't know if I can ever forget," I said, honestly, "but maybe we can figure out how to move forward. Together." Relief washed over her face, and for the first time in weeks I felt a flicker of something other than anger or sadness. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. We decided to take things slowly. Counseling became a cornerstone of our healing process, both individually and as a couple. The sessions were raw and uncomfortable at times, forcing us to confront truths we'd avoided for years. But with every step forward, I began to see a version of us that could exist beyond the betrayal, a version built on honesty and effort. Months passed, and while the pain didn't disappear, it dulled with time. We learned how to talk to each other again, how to listen without judgment, and how to rebuild the trust that had been broken. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elena reached for my hand. Her touch was hesitant, as if asking for permission. I didn't pull away. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "For giving us another chance," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "For believing we were worth it." I turned to her then, studying her face, the woman I had chosen to forgive, not because it was easy, but because love was never meant to be simple. "We're not there yet," I said honestly, "but we're getting closer." She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled back. The road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but it was ours to walk together. And in that moment, I knew we still had a chance.